9 creepy mysteries resolved by unbelievable surprise twists. Fiction often pulls the rug out from under the audience and blindsides them with a surprise plot twist. When done well, plot twists can work very effectively, but if the twist is ridiculously contrived and unbelievable, it can take the audience out of the story. However, ridiculously contrived and unbelievable plot twists sometimes do happen in real life. The following cases started off as mysteries but wound up resolved by circumstances as crazy and unexpected as anything a writer could have dreamed up. 1. Missing man is found inside deceased drag queen's trunk. Dorian Corey was a black, transgender drag queen and dressmaker who was living in Harlem when she died from AIDS in 1993. She was, by most, if not all, accounts, a witty, unflappable, caring woman who took her role as a veteran drag queen and mentor in the community seriously. In the Harlem drag ball scene she was a diva, the matriarch of her drag family, the House of Corey. On a 1991 episode of The Joan Rivers Show, she explained that you lend money to your friends, not very much money, and give advice. Sometimes, if someone got evicted or whatever, you might take them in. Corey was a graduate of the Parsons School of Design who appeared self-possessed and world-weary, qualities that endeared her to a more mainstream audience. But the truth of the matter is that she was a marginalized black woman living in a dangerous world, which maybe makes what her friends discovered rotting in her closet seem like less of a shock. In October of 1993, just a few months after Corey's death, friend and fellow drag queen Lois Taylor was in Corey's apartment looking for costumes that could be recycled or handed down when she noticed a heavy bag lying on the floor of the closet. It was too heavy to move, so she and a couple other people sliced the bag open with scissors. Inside layers of fabric, naugahyde, faux leather, and plastic, they found a decomposing body. They immediately called the police. The body, miraculously identified through fingerprints as Robert Bobby Worley, aka Robert Wells, was partially mummified and curled into the fetal position. His skin had turned a mottled purple and yellow, his clothes were tattered, and most telling, a bullet hole was found in his head. Worley was a criminal who had been arrested for raping and assaulting a woman in 1963, but had not been heard from since serving a 3-year jail sentence. That fact, combined with the discovery of beer can pull tabs wrapped with his body that dated back to the 1960s and 70s, led detectives to conclude that the shooting probably took place at least 20 years prior to the discovery of the body. Originally it was thought that Corey might have taken the body in order to protect one of her family members, though that theory fell out of favor some time ago. After that, it was thought that Worley, a known criminal, must have broken in and tried to rob the drag queen and dressmaker, who shot him in self-defense. She lived in a dangerous neighborhood, after all, and it's a fair assumption that she owned a gun for the purpose of protecting herself. Once evidence surfaced that Worley and Corey were engaged in a romantic relationship, however, it became clear that Corey's reasons for pulling the trigger might be more complex. According to Lois Taylor, who discovered the body, Corey wrote a short story about a transgender woman who killed her lover, and in hindsight, the tale seems like it could be autobiographical, as it's littered with facts from her real life. There's more. 2. A friend says that Corey confessed to the murder during a drug haze while in the hospital in her final days, and allegedly there's a police interview with Worley's brother that states that Robert showed up one night drunk, and he was going on and on about Dorian, proving that he and Corey had a relationship. How did she get away with it, though, and why hide the body instead of getting rid of it? It turns out the answers to both of those questions are pretty simple, if you use knowledge of the lifestyle, the time, and common sense. Richard Mailman, author of the upcoming stage play Dorian's Closet, has a few ideas about what happened, and how it turned out the way that it did. Being in a relationship with someone who was abusive would make sense, especially when you're talking about when men are attracted to trans people. My sense is that we're talking about someone who might be closeted about their homosexuality as well, so there might have been all kinds of hatred and internalized oppression. My sense of it is that it was a dangerous situation that Dorian needed to get out of. In other words, their relationship became toxic, maybe violent, and Dorian felt as if she had no choice. But that didn't mean she could simply go to the police, as Mailman posits here. I don't think she had a criminal mind. She didn't plan the murder, and when it happened, she had to think fast. In the mind of someone who commits a crime of passion, that kind of makes sense. Not to mention that dragging a body through the congested streets of New York would have presented a set of problems all on its own. It makes sense, like he says, that she would have done her best to neutralize the odor and other lovely effects of decomposition, shove it in a closet, and do her best to forget it was there. Since Worley was a criminal estranged from his family, there was no one to come looking for him when he disappeared, a sad fact that certainly worked in Corey's favor, as well. Perhaps it's not so surprising, though, that a woman who was part of a highly marginalized world managed to commit murder and never answer questions about it during her lifetime. With stage plays and other performance pieces dedicated to the mystery of her life, though, Dorian Corey has managed to leave a mark on her little piece of the world, which, according to an interview she did for the documentary film Paris is Burning, she might not have minded. Everybody wants to make an impression, some mark upon the world. Then you think, you've made a mark on the world if you just get through it, and a few people remember your name. If you shoot an arrow and it goes real high, hooray for you. She may never have expected to be remembered for what was discovered in her closet after her death. But maybe she would simply be happy to be remembered at all, for you cannot tell the story of what happened after she died without telling the story of her life, which is the story of others like her, and it immortalizes their way of life for all time. 2. 36-year-old cold case solved by homeless man's chewing gum. It was neighbors who had called police, worried about the 70-year-old woman they hadn't seen for days around her Augusta, Maine, home. Investigators also became concerned when their knocks went unanswered. When they went inside the wood frame house, they found blood splattered on kitchen cupboards and glass shards around the first floor. Blanche M. Kimball fought her attacker but had been stabbed nearly 24 times in the chest, and more than a dozen times in the head. Police didn't know exactly when she died, thought it was sometime between the day they found her, June 12, 1976, and the date on her supermarket receipt from a week earlier. For nearly 36 years, police say, her killer went free until Seattle police arrested him earlier this month. Kimball's death is now the oldest unsolved Maine homicide case to result in a charge. What helped break the case, bringing headlines from around the world, were sticks of gum in the suspect's love of apple pie. Several details of the case have been reported, but the detective who created the elaborate ruse hasn't shared his account, until now. A call from Maine. On the 7th floor of Seattle Police Headquarters, Mike Siesinski's bookshelves are bowed by the weight of packed, 2-inch blue binders. Each contains a Seattle case that remains unsolved, though in the last few years he's been putting them away. Last year, the oldest cold case in Seattle history to result in charges was closed after work by Siesinski. The killer from that 1968 case, Sam P. Evans, is also in prison for a 1972 Seattle killing investigated by SPD's Homicide Unit. In a 7th-floor homicide interview room last year, Siesinski watched killer Jack McCulloch literally back himself into a corner with lies he knew weren't working. McCulloch, whom Siesinski and his partner arrested in North Seattle, is being sentenced next month for the murder of a 7-year-old Illinois girl, the nation's oldest solved cold case, in 1957. Earlier this year, Siesinski received a call about the 1976 murder in Maine. The DNA of a 63-year-old Seattle homeless man, Gary Robb, had been matched to blood splattered around the crime scene. Robb, known as Gary Robert Wilson in 1976, had lived in Kimball's home briefly and was suspected in her death, especially after he was found breaking into a home near hers just before he left town. To prove their case, the Maine State Police wanted another sample of Robb's DNA. Powell claims gets sympathy. The idea of cold case investigations created by TV has detectives tracking a suspect until he spits, collecting that saliva, and later swooping in with an arrest team. That's not as easy as it sounds, said Cloyd Steiger, Siesinski's partner who helped with the McCulloch case. In reality, police don't have the resources to follow a suspect for days until he spits or drops a cigarette butt. And when a sample isn't handed to a detective, it raises questions about who else might have handled it. Was that someone else's cigarette butt? Could that glass have been handled by another person, even briefly? Siesinski said credit is due to the Maine State Police and Augusta Police Department, which worked for years to solve Kimball's homicide. This arrest was made, he said, because of that teamwork. Gary Robb, who is part of the Muka tribe, had previously picked up his mail from the Seattle Indian Center, but hadn't been seen there for more than a year. In 2010, he had been on the streets of Capitol Hill when he was the subject of an article in The Stranger. It told of how Robb was a prisoner of war at a camp in Cambodia for 3 years, and how he lived in a bamboo cage set in a river that rushed around his legs. Writer Zachary Watterson told of the time Rob used the rock to cut open the bamboo cage and escaped. He also claimed Rob's captors yanked out his teeth, and as he talked, I could see his toothless gums, Watterson wrote. A group of sociology students also profiled Rob last December as part of their Invisible Heroes project, saying the suffering and sacrifices that he's made for the United States continues to go unrecognized by our society. But the video and the stranger story were just that, a story. Rob was never a pal. Syasinski, whose son served in Afghanistan, said a background check on Rob showed he never even served in Vietnam. But the Port Angeles native was sent to a Washington prison in early 1984 for a rape case. His booking photo shows a slender, 5'6" man with a black buzz cut and an intense glare. Officers noted numerous scars, 3-inch marks on his right and left hands, as well as scars on his stomach, and the top of his head. His booking info doesn't mention missing teeth. In 2000 and 2008, Rob pleaded guilty in Seattle property destruction cases. A year ago, Rob was on Capitol Hill, in the 1500 block of 14th Avenue, when he began yelling at another man. Hospital photos show the gash Rob allegedly put in the man's stomach, though charges were not filed because the victim could not be located. But DNA from that knife matched the blood splattered at the homicide scene in 1976. You can really taste the apple pie. Syasinski found Rob on the avenue, the section of University Way Northeast known for transients and street drug deals. Earlier this year, Syasinski had the idea to buy 3 packs of gum and 3 packs of cigarettes. He made a single-sheet survey with the names in all caps: Carlton, Maverick and Viceroy for the cigarettes, peppermint, apple pie and sweet watermelon for the Wrigley's Extra. The afternoon of July 18, Syasinski and partner Frank Clark went to the University District where Syasinski, dressed in khakis and plain clothes, asked another homeless man if he'd seen Rob. The man asked why. Syasinski said Rob had Veterans Administration benefits coming, and the man pointed the homicide detective in the general direction. Syasinski found Rob crouched against a brick building at 4520. He offered $5 for the survey, trying first with cigarettes. I don't smoke, Rob said. So Syasinski tried the gum, but Rob replied he didn't have any teeth. Syasinski said he could get the $5 if he just put the gum in his mouth and gave his feedback on the flavor. The first was peppermint, which Rob thought was terrible. He spit it out into a manila envelope. The second was an extra dessert delights sugar-free apple pie flavor. Man, I like this one, police recall Rob saying. You can really taste the apple pie. You like it so much, I'm going to take a picture of you, Syasinski said. That picture is in one of the 2-inch blue binders, along with a probable cause statement and the fake survey sheet Rob signed that afternoon. He spit the apple pie gum into a second manila envelope that was rushed to the Maine State Police, who confirmed it matched DNA found at the 1976 homicide scene. The first envelope was also sent, along with a third with a used piece of Wrigley's sweet watermelon flavor. Oh, thanks man, Syasinski recalled Rob saying after getting the $5. I'll see you guys later. The next time he did, they were there to arrest him. Rob didn't say much on the street that October afternoon, or when Syasinski tried to interview him in the 7th floor homicide interview room. A few doors down, Syasinski has the same packs of gum atop the computer where he typed the bogus survey. As he recalled the case last week, he tried a piece of the apple pie flavor that helped incriminate Rob. It tastes great, he said. But the Maine State Police owe me $5. 3. Couple's disappearance tied to notorious con man. Linda and her husband, Jonathan Sohas, sometimes called John in media accounts, disappeared from their home in the 1900 block of Lorraine Road in San Marino, California on February 8, 1985. A photo of Jonathan is posted below this case summary. They said they were going to Connecticut to look for employment. They never returned home. The couple was reported missing on April 8, 2 months after they were last seen. The Sohuses left behind their 4 cats, and Linda left her job at the science fiction, fantasy bookstore Dangerous Visions. Authorities stated they had a happy marriage, and weren't having any problems in their lives in 1985. They lived with Jonathan's mother, who died 3 years later. There is some evidence that Linda was alive in the years following her disappearance. Some of Linda's friends and relatives received postcards supposedly written by her and mailed from France, but authorities were unable to authenticate the writing on the cards. Handwriting experts disagree as to whether they were in Linda's writing or not. Her boss also received calls from a credit card company and an employer, asking her to serve as a reference for Linda. At the time of their disappearances, the Sohuses were renting out a guest house on their property. Their tenant, Christopher Chichester, told John and Linda's friends and co-workers that they'd gone to Paris for an extended honeymoon, then that they were on the East Coast doing secret government work. Chichester himself disappeared before the police could interview him about the Sohuses. Around the time of their disappearances, neighbors reported a foul smell coming from the guest house chimney, and investigators later found a sizable amount of blood in the house. A few months later, a friend of Chichester noticed a patch of disturbed ground near the guest house. He accepted Chichester's explanation that the digging had been due to plumbing problems. In 1988, Chichester resurfaced in Connecticut, using the name Christopher Mountbatten Crowe. He tried, without success, to sell a white Nissan pickup truck belonging to Jonathan. Again, he left the area before the police could question him. The Sohuses' property was eventually sold. In 1994, when the new owners were putting in a swimming pool, they found the partial skeleton of a small adult Caucasian male wrapped in 3 plastic bags. The man had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The skeleton matched Jonathan's characteristics, but authorities were unable to identify it for years because there was no jawbone or teeth, and they didn't have a DNA sample from Jonathan's biological relatives. The skeleton was finally conclusively identified as his in 2010. Investigators excavated the property and used ground-penetrating radar to look for a second body, but they found nothing of interest. The Sohus case received additional attention in 2008, when Clark Rockefeller kidnapped his young daughter during a custody dispute with his ex-wife. He assaulted the social worker supervising their visitation, fled and took the child from Massachusetts to Baltimore, Maryland, and was arrested there a week later. Authorities determined that Clark Rockefeller and Christopher Chichester were the same person, and that his real identity was Christian Karl Gerhard Streeter, born in West Germany in 1961. Gerhard Streeter came to the United States as an exchange student when he was in his teens and subsequently took on a number of identities. He attended a high school in Connecticut and, for a short period, the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He married in Wisconsin in 1981, but his wife later said he left her the day after the wedding. She finally obtained a divorce in 1992. He moved to California and started calling himself Christopher Chichester in 1983. He claimed he was a baronet, and gave the impression of being a wealthy, cultured individual. He adopted the Rockefeller identity in 1993 and posed as a member of the wealthy and prominent family of the same name. His wife filed for divorce in 2006. After a 12-year marriage, she moved to England with their daughter, and her ex-husband was granted only 3 supervised visitations a year. It was during one of those visits that Gerhard Streeter abducted the child. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the kidnapping. Photos of him are posted below this case summary. In March 2011, Gerhard Streeter was charged with Jonathan's murder. He was still serving his sentence in Massachusetts for kidnapping at the time. He has not been charged in connection with Linda's disappearance. His attorney stated Gerhard Streeter remembered little of his life before 1993, barely knew the Sohuses and was not involved in their cases. At his trial in 2013, Gerhard Streeter's defense admitted he had committed many crimes, but maintained he was innocent of murder. The defense suggested Linda had murdered her husband and then walked out of her life. The prosecution's case against Gerhard Streeter was almost wholly circumstantial. No motive for the murder was suggested, and he did not testify. He was convicted of Jonathan's murder in April 2013. The prosecutor believes Gerhard Streeter murdered Linda as well. Linda was very interested in science fiction and belonged to the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society. She also enjoyed painting animals and fantasy creatures under the pseudonym Cody, and sometimes took commissions for paintings. Linda's case remains unsolved and foul play is suspected. 4. Killer holds onto evidence for 54 years. 55 years after Maria Ridolph vanished from a small-town street corner while playing in the snow, a former neighbor was sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping and killing the brown-eyed second grader. Jack Daniel McCulloch, who was 17 and known as John Tessier back in 1957, was finally identified 2 years ago by Maria's childhood companion as Johnny, the blonde man with the ducktail haircut who offered the girls piggyback rides and carried Maria off into oblivion. McCulloch, who worked as a police officer for a time in Washington state, was convicted of child abduction and murder after a 2-week trial in September. He continues to assert his innocence. In court Monday, McCulloch claimed he was framed by corrupt police and prosecutors. He pointed at a white box on the defense table that he said contained 4,000 pages of FBI reports from 1957. He said agents interviewed 1,800 people and cleared him. And then, his hand still resting on the box, he urged the judge, "Your Honor, in the name of justice and fairness, open the box and view the truth." Judge James Halleck had ruled the documents inadmissible in McCulloch's trial. The case is believed by investigators to be the oldest cold case to go to trial and result in a conviction. McCulloch was sentenced under laws that were in effect in 1957. After the 90-minute hearing, snowflakes fell on Redolph's brother, Charles, and sister, Patricia Quinn, as they stood on the courthouse steps and said they were relieved Maria had finally received justice. "This has been a nightmare for our family," Charles Redolph said. Quinn added that the crime changed Sycamore. People were afraid. McCulloch, now 73, was questioned during the first days of the investigation but was never considered a suspect, because he seemed to have the perfect alibi. He and his parents said he was miles away in Rockford, enlisting in the Air Force and taking a physical. He left Sycamore days after Maria's disappearance, and served in the Air Force and then the Army. He was stationed for a time in Vietnam, rose to the rank of captain and was awarded the Bronze Star for bravery in combat, his lawyer said. The murder case went cold, but Sycamore never forgot about Maria Redolph. On the 40th anniversary of her disappearance, a monument was erected outside Sycamore's police station. It says, in part, "This is in memory of Maria Redolph, who on December 3, 1957, was kidnapped while playing near her home. She was found murdered in the spring of 1958. This also is in honor of the great people in our community that reached out in love and compassion." McCulloch's youngest sister, a baby at the time of the crime, contacted an Illinois State Police tip line in 2008, and told investigators that her dying mother had pulled her close in her hospital room years earlier and, referring to Redolph's murder, said, "John did it. John did it, and you have to tell someone." Janet Tessier added that her mother was agitated and emotional at the time, and expressed a great deal of guilt, according to a transcript obtained by CNN. After state police reopened the case, they interviewed a former girlfriend in Florida, and eventually poked holes in McCulloch's alibi. A government-issued train ticket fell out of the back of a photograph the woman mailed to police, and an expert authenticated the ticket and said it had not been used. Kathy Sigmund Chapman, who was playing with Maria the night she was abducted, picked that photo of McCulloch out of a police lineup in September 2010. Although she had viewed hundreds, if not thousands, of photos before, it was the first time she'd been able to identify Johnny. She testified that she was certain she had identified the right man. The girls had been excited as the first snowflakes of the season fell on the evening of December 3, 1957, Chapman recalled. They asked to go back outside after dinner. The Tessier family lived around the corner and 2 blocks down Center Cross Street from Archie Place, where the girls' families lived. Because he was older, Maria and Kathy did not know John Tessier, a high school dropout. Johnny asked the girls if they liked dolls and if they'd like to ride in a truck, bus or train. Maria ran home and returned with a favorite doll. Then Chapman left Maria alone with Johnny and went home to fetch her mittens. When she came back, they were both gone. She alerted Maria's brother, Charles. A massive search began, which continued throughout December. Maria's doll was found by a neighbor's garage. The missing child case drew dozens of FBI agents to this small farming community about 60 miles west of Chicago. FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover demanded daily updates, which were shared with President Dwight Eisenhower. The disappearance of the 7-year-old with the perfect Sunday school attendance was national news, for a while, as 1,000 volunteers scoured fields of corn stubble for clues. Maria's remains were found in the spring by a retired couple looking for mushrooms under the melting snow. She was 120 miles from home, in a field near the town of Galena and not far from a river campground, where the Tessier family spent vacations. 5. Woman leads police to murder victim after alleged psychic vision. A Burbank woman whose psychic vision led detectives to the body of a murder victim was wrongly arrested, a judge ruled Thursday, saying that Los Angeles police lacked sufficient evidence to tie her to the killing. A Van Nuys Superior Court jury will decide today the amount of damages the woman, Etta Louise Smith, should be paid by the city for a 4-day stay in jail she likened to being a caged animal. Smith, 39, sued the police department alleging that detectives lacked reasonable grounds to arrest her in 1980 for murder after her vision led her to the body of a missing Sylmar nurse. Smith's attorney, James E. Blatt, said after Judge Joel Rudolph's verdict that his client felt that she had finally been taken seriously. After 6.5 years, that's a tremendous relief, Blatt said. 2 days after the nurse's highly publicized disappearance, Smith reported to police that she envisioned the woman's body dumped in a rural area above Lakeview Terrace, testimony in the 7-day trial revealed. Within 45 minutes after relating her vision to detectives, Smith, accompanied by 2 of her children and a niece, found the body and led police to the location in Lopez Canyon. Doubting her story, detectives questioned Smith for about 10 hours before arresting her on suspicion of having murdered the nurse, Melanie L. Uribe, 31. Smith, then a Pacoima resident, was released 4 days later and never charged. 3 men with no known connection to Smith eventually were convicted of the murder and are serving sentences of up to life in state prison. Blatt argued that police never really believed that Smith was involved in the beating death, but suspected that she might have learned of the body's location through means other than a psychic vision. Detectives surmised that a weekend in jail might scare Smith into divulging the true source, the lawyer asserted. At the time of Smith's arrest, Blatt noted, police had a witness who had seen 3 men abduct Uribe. Not a crime. Finding a body is not a crime, Blatt argued. Having a vision, is not a crime. Having information about the murder, it is not a crime. Having information about the murder and not giving it to police is not a crime. It just isn't there. Rudolph agreed, saying that probable cause was not shown by the evidence. Assistant City Attorney Michael K. Fox argued that the officers acted reasonably. Confronted with a bizarre tale of a psychic vision, detectives believed that Smith could only have known of the body's location if she was connected to the killing as an active participant, conspirator or accessory, he said. Smith claims that she has suffered physical and emotional distress as a result of the arrest and has been hampered in her career. 6. Innocent man released after real killer comes forward. In the summer of 1989, Jeffrey Scott Hornoff was a married 27-year-old Warwick, Rhode Island police officer with an infant child. As a member of the Warwick Police Scuba and Underwater Assault Team, Hornoff met 29-year-old Victoria Cushman, an employee of Warwick's Alpine Ski and Dive Shop. That friendship resulted in 2 sexual encounters between Hornoff and Cushman during a 2-week period that summer. Although it was not a serious relationship, she perhaps wished it was when she told several people at the sporting goods store where she worked that she thought he was going to leave his wife for her. On August 11, 1989, 2 days after telling co-workers that Hornoff wanted to resume mostly being friends with her, Victoria Cushman didn't show up for work. Several of them went to her apartment and found her lying in a pool of blood. She had been bludgeoned to death with a 17-pound fire extinguisher that was found near her. Initial suspicion that Hornoff might be her killer was fueled when an unmailed sealed letter to him was found in her apartment. In that letter she wrote she understood they could have no future, but they could continue to have a present. She wanted to continue the affair. A co-worker of Cushman's corroborated the essence of the letter by telling police she had expressed surprise and disappointment that Hornoff only wanted a platonic friendship with her. Hornoff was young, he had been building a good career and he was handsome, so it was easy to see why Cushman would be interested in him. Hornoff aided the appearance of his possible guilt, when he was questioned by police interrogators who knew the contents of the letter. Although he readily acknowledged he knew Victoria Cushman, to shield his 2 intimacies with her from his wife, he denied they had been anything other than friends. However, within an hour he acknowledged the 2 encounters he had with Cushman. Yet, any circumstantial appearance of Hornoff's guilt was counteracted by his seemingly rock-solid alibi of being at a party with his wife and friends on the night of Victoria Cushman's murder. Although inadmissible as evidence in court, his continuous presence at that party was supported by the results of a polygraph test he requested. The results of that test, administered by a Warwick PD detective, were reviewed by 3 other experts who all concurred that Hornoff was being truthful about his whereabouts at the time the murder occurred. The offer of Hornoff's wife and brother to take polygraph tests to corroborate the one taken by Hornoff was ignored by authorities. A grand jury that considered the evidence against Hornoff was dismissed without indicting him. Since there was no physical evidence of any kind or any witnesses linking him to the murder, and the Rhode Island State Patrol took over the murder investigation, because of inter-office bickering over handling of the case between the Warwick P. D's Major Crime Unit and their police supervisors, Jeffrey Scott Aronoff, wasn't charged with Victoria Cushman's murder until a second grand jury indicted him more than 5 years after her death. However, he had been painted with a black brush for so long, that as Warwick City Councilman Carlo Piscio said recently, by then it was almost common knowledge that Scott had killed the girl. All indications were that he was guilty and that the cops had covered for him. Aronoff's ace in the hole at his trial was his alibi of being at a party with many other people when Victoria Cushman was murdered. The prosecution, however, casually brushed that aside. It claimed he slipped away, murdered her, and returned to the party without anyone noticing either his absence, or anything about the condition of his clothing that one would expect to be visible if he had just committed a brutal and messy murder with a fire extinguisher. The prosecutors made that claim even though they knew what the jury wasn't told. Aronoff's statement he was at the party at the time Cushman was murdered was unanimously supported by the 4 experts that evaluated the police-administered polygraph test. The unmailed letter was presented as circumstantial evidence of his motive, although there was no evidence he knew of the letter prior to being told by police it existed, and his initial claim of having only been friends with her was presented as circumstantial evidence he tried to cover up murdering her. After the jury bought the prosecutor's argument and convicted Jeffrey Scott Aronoff of murder without any proof he was guilty, he professed his innocence at his sentencing. He told the packed courtroom, "Am I guilty of something? Yes, I am. I broke my sacred wedding vows, and for that I will never forgive myself." Sentenced to life in prison, the Rhode Island Supreme Court unanimously dismissed Aronoff's arguments when it upheld his conviction in 1999. However, the affirmation of his conviction and sentence was somewhat hollow, because his appellate lawyers had failed to cover substantial points of law and possible reversible errors brought to her attention by Aronoff's trial lawyer. At that point, all indications were that he would be spending the rest of his life in prison, branded as a heinous and vicious murderer. However, fate intervened on his behalf when on Friday, November 1, 2002, 45-year-old carpenter Todd Barry walked into the office of the Rhode Island Attorney General and confessed to murdering Victoria Cushman. Barry indicated he was consumed with guilt over an innocent man spending his life in prison for something Barry had done. After the AG's office spent the weekend comparing Barry's confession with the known evidence and facts of the case, he was charged on Monday, November 4, with her murder. The degree to which Victoria Cushman's murder was inadequately investigated is indicated by the facts that although Barry lived near her, he had dated her off and on for more than a year, and his name and telephone number was near the front of her Rolodex seized by police from her home. He was never considered a suspect and was never questioned about her murder. Almost 14 years after the fact, and only after Barry had confessed, a prosecutor publicly acknowledged the two had met in the summer of 1988 and developed an on-again, off-again relationship that was primarily sexual. Yet in spite of the trail a mile wide leading straight to him, Todd Barry was home free once law enforcement officials mistakenly locked onto Aronoff as her killer. At that point they became tunnel blind to clues leading to anyone else, and all meaningful investigation into her murder ended. Although they had a friendship with Victoria Cushman in common, there is no evidence that Barry or Aronoff had ever met or knew of each other. Jeffrey Scott Aronoff walked out of the Providence County Courthouse a free man on November 6, 5 days after Todd Barry confessed to Victoria Cushman's murder. His release on bail pending further proceedings was ordered by the same judge that had presided over his trial and, assuming his guilt, had sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Aronoff's claim of innocence had fallen on the deaf ears and to the blind eyes of everyone, including the judge, who chose to substitute the appearance of his guilt for any proof that he actually was. Although Barry's confession is what led to Aronoff's release, concerned people had been publicizing his nearly self-evident innocence for some time. The group truthandjustice.org, for example, explained on its website that the case against him was based on innuendos and speculation. There were no fingerprints, no blood evidence, no DNA matches, no witnesses, and no evidence. Given Aronoff's conviction in spite of an absence of evidence he was guilty, the comment of the Rhode Island State Police's commander of the Detective Division to a Providence Journal reporter about his case is indicative of why it is reliably estimated that at least 15% of everyone imprisoned in this country is innocent. "I can assure you from a state police standpoint, we did nothing different in this homicide investigation than we would in any other. Rhode Island Attorney General Sheldon Whitehouse tried to deflect attention away from the failure of the police to adequately investigate Victoria Cushman's murder and the failure of the prosecutors to demand evidence Jeffrey Scott Hornoff was guilty before prosecuting him. Whitehouse used the same sort of hollow sophistry and disregard for the truth that led to Hornoff's false conviction when he denied investigators and prosecutors did anything improper or wrong. Although Hornoff was the victim of a horrible wrong by law enforcement officials and judges that obliterated his life, Whitehouse blamed him for his wrongful prosecution, conviction and imprisonment by saying he shouldn't have made the sort of misstatements to police typical of someone who is trying to hide something. Yet it was soon made plain to police after they first questioned Hornoff in 1989 that he was trying to hide something. His two intimate encounters with Victoria Cushman from his wife. For initially lying to police about that indiscretion he paid the heavy price of being tormented and punished for over 13 years, the 7 years he spent as a suspect and accused from her 1989 murder to his 1996 conviction, and the 6.5 years he spent in Rhode Island's maximum security prison falsely branded as her killer. The horrific travesty perpetrated on Jeffrey Scott Hornoff by the police, the prosecutors, and the trial and appellate court judges involved in this case is not lessened by the sophomoric effort of Rhode Island officials to cover up for their blundering incompetence and callousness. All he can now do is rebuild his life from the ashes of the atomic bomb dropped on it, from his purely coincidental choice of having two sexual encounters with Victoria Cushman close to the time she was murdered by Todd Barry. In a particularly cruel twist of fate, the wife he had tried to protect from knowing about his intimacies with Victoria Cushman by lying to the police, divorced him while he was in prison. It was that lie told to try to preserve his marriage that prosecutors used to destroy his credibility, and falsely paint him as a heinous murderer. So telling that lie intended to protect what A.G. Whitehouse called the small secret of his indiscretion is what he spent over 6 years in prison for. Not her murder. When released from custody on November 6, Jeffrey Scott Hornoff literally had nothing but the clothes on his back. His home, his wife, his career, and his possessions, it was all gone. 5 weeks later, on December 11, 2002, about 150 people turned out for a fundraising dinner in Warwick, Rhode Island to help him get back on his feet financially. Over $5,300 was raised and his 3 sons, who now have their father back, attended. On January 7, 2003, Todd Barry's plea to second-degree murder that was arranged between his lawyers and the prosecutors was accepted by Superior Court Judge Nettie Vogel. The judge then imposed the agreed-to sentence of 30 years in prison with 15 years suspended, which means Barry will be eligible for parole in 10 years. It is an embarrassment to the Rhode Island judiciary and law enforcement officials, and an affront to Victoria Cushman's family, that the sentence given to her murderer was significantly less than the one given to an innocent Jeffrey Scott Hornoff after his wrongful conviction. That disparity is magnified by Barry's claim that his responsibility for her murder is mitigated by its occurrence during an argument. That assertion is farcical on its face. She was found dead with a plastic night guard in her mouth, which a person only inserts when going to sleep to prevent teeth grinding. In other words, Barry beat her to death with a 17-pound fire extinguisher while she slept, or immediately after she had awoken. Yet the judge and prosecutors let him off the hook by allowing him to plead guilty to a charge from which he will be released from prison in his early to mid-50s. He was still young enough to enjoy life, unlike Victoria Cushman whose life he viciously snuffed out. Later that same day, Jeffrey Scott Hornoff was officially exonerated of Victoria Cushman's murder. In his own way, Judge Robert D. Cross, the same judge that had presided over Hornoff's false conviction and sentenced him to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, embarrassed himself during that proceeding as much as Judge Vogel did during Todd Barry's sentencing. Although Judge Cross knew all the facts of the case and was one of the principal people responsible for the terrible injustice that had been perpetrated on Jeffrey Scott Hornoff, he only dismissed Hornoff's charges after the prosecutor told him during the hearing that it was in the interests of justice for him to do so. The judge was also disrespectful of Hornoff and the ordeal he had been a party to putting him through, by failing to look at him during the hearing. Appearing on the Today Show, Jeffrey Scott Hornoff said of his experience, "There were a lot of moments of bitterness while I was in prison, but I'm doing my best to leave the anger and the resentment at the door and not let it consume me. There's a lot of emotions going on. On one hand, I was happy for me and for my family, Finally having this weight off our shoulders and this shadow taken away. I felt a great deal of sadness for Vicky's family. 7. Murder is solved by uncovering illegitimate child of deceased man. The body of Yara Gambricio, a 13-year-old student, was found on a chilly day in a quiet northern city in Lombardy in February 2011, 3 months after she was reported missing following a gymnastics practice. The autopsy showed she had been beaten but not sexually abused, stabbed several times and left to die in a field less than 10 miles from her home. The autopsy also revealed stains on the young girl's frayed clothing, a liquid that contained the DNA of a person whom investigators called unknown male number 1. In the absence of other evidence, investigators embarked on the country's largest DNA dragnet, taking genetic samples from nearly 22,000 people. Finally, last month, they said they had found their suspect, Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti, a 43-year-old father of 3 from Lombardy. But what some praised as a triumph of modern science and 21st century sleuthing, has also set off a debate about the risks of privacy violations, and the darkened corners of the past they can expose, after the DNA testing also revealed something unknown even to the suspect's family, that he was the illegitimate son of a man who had died in 1999. Geneticists arrived at this conclusion after narrowing the DNA search to one local family and a long-dead bus driver, whose known sons did not match the genetic sample found on the slain girl's body. The dead man's DNA was first lifted from a stamp he had licked. Later, he was exhumed to carry out further tests. When a match was made last month, and Mr. Bossetti was arrested, the ensuing media frenzy was set off in part by the details of what one newspaper described as a genetic soap opera. Recent confidences on the part of the residents of small towns in Lombardy about a long ago, and until now secret, affair eventually led investigators to the mother of unknown male number 1, who presumably cuckolded her husband with a local acquaintance in the late 1960s. Italy's privacy watchdog eventually berated the media for leaking news of the alleged affair, and for pursuing comment from its unsuspecting protagonists, notably the cuckolded husband and the wife, and the suspect's known and newly discovered siblings. A sharply worded statement by Italy's privacy authority called on media outlets to use maximum respect and reporting personal details incidental to the case of the murdered girl. Not even the public interest legitimizes the media frenzy over intimate personal details such as, to create irreparable damage to family life and personal relations, Antonello Soro, the chief of Italy's data protection agency, said in a statement. Investigators had initially concentrated their efforts on tracking down people whose mobile phones had been used near where the girl was abducted and killed. The families of classmates were tested, as were regulars at a nearby discotheque and the members of the sports center where Miss Gambricio had taken gym classes. Investigators said they could have eventually tested all 120,000 phone owners intercepted in the area that night. But I don't know if we would have gotten them all, said Letizia Ruggieri, the lead prosecutor in the case. Luckily we didn't have to. Despite the sheer number of people tracked down for DNA testing, the investigation raised few eyebrows in Italy. A court order can be issued in case someone refuses to be tested, but I never needed one because everyone submitted to the test voluntarily, Ms. Ruggieri said. She acknowledged the extraordinary scale of the case, both in costs and in manpower, noting that it had been a one-of-a-kind situation. But there was no legal obstacle to our doing it, Ms. Ruggieri said. The previously unknown familial ties and their public exposure are the unfortunate collateral effects of a complicated case, said Carlo Previdier, a forensic geneticist at the University of Pavia, where hundreds of DNA samples, including swabs from some 500 women identified as potential birth mothers of the suspect, were tested. The women included former classmates, colleagues, shopkeepers, neighbors and clients who would have known the deceased bus driver in the late 1960s. The testing eventually identified the birth mother. Professor Previdier's lab positively identified Mr. Bossetti after testing DNA material taken, during a breath analyzer test staged by investigators, who pretended to stop him by chance. The important fact is that this man's DNA is the same as the DNA found on Yara, he said, noting that the odds of anyone else sharing the same genetic profile was 1 person out of 2 billion of billions are practically non-existent. For investigators and the national media, the positive DNA match immediately emerged as the smoking gun in a case that had floundered for months and had resulted in one wrongful arrest. By most media accounts, the case is effectively closed. Mr. Bossetti's casual Facebook musings have been deconstructed to glean diabolical intent, Personal habits, including a very Italian propensity to frequent tanning salons, have been reread by commentators in a dark, narcissistic key. Even the suspect's reputation as a family man who attended church has been recast as a modern-day version of the classic wolf in sheep's clothing. There's the desire to punish, to dole out an exemplary punishment. The trial is as good as done because of the media effect, said Roberto Barberi, a lawyer who defended a Moroccan man arrested and released a few days after Yara's disappearance. Valerio Spigurli, president of the National Criminal Lawyers Body, is among those who have challenged the public dissemination of genetic information gathered through such vast DNA screening. When something leads to very personal rights, like paternity or maternity, perhaps the results could have been guarded a little more jealously, he said. Prosecutors say that while the DNA match is very revealing, other evidence consolidates their case, including the suspect's presence in the area on the night of the murder. Furthermore, the suspect's genetic material was found on the young girl's underwear and leggings, a sensitive spot, next to a cut, and its presence in that spot would be difficult to explain otherwise, said Miss Ruggeri, the prosecutor. DNA doesn't fly, said Luciano Garofano, the retired commander of the military police's leading forensic department, based in Parma. Mr. Bossetti insists he does not know how his DNA got onto Yara's body. He spoke to prosecutors this month, answering all the questions put to him, and explaining some elements. One of his lawyers, Claudio Salvani, said. Yet even geneticists certain of the DNA match balk when it comes to definitively pinning the murder on the unknown male number one. There is no doubt, said Giuseppe Novelli, an acclaimed geneticist and chancellor of the University of Rome Tor Vergata, whose department worked on the case, that the DNA traces found on the young girl belongs to the match. There is no doubt, either, that he is the illegitimate son of a dead man, he said. But whether he is the murderer, I don't know, Professor Novelli said. Now we have to decide how it got on Yara's body. 8. Convicted, acquitted, and convicted again of the same crime. Courtroom experts call it a one-of-kind murder mystery that some people believe has yet to be completely solved. The remarkable story of Timothy Hennis and the stabbing deaths of a mother and two small girls is full of shocking legal twists and turns. During the course of 21 years, Hennis underwent 3 trials for the same crimes in 3 courtrooms. The case puts constitutional questions about double jeopardy squarely under the spotlight. It all began in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in 1985. Hennis, who was then a 27-year-old Army soldier based at nearby Fort Bragg, visited the home of Catherine Eastburn and her husband, Gary, a captain in the Air Force. The Eastburns were planning to move outside the country, and had placed an ad in the newspaper to sell their dog. Hennis stopped by the house in response to the ad. 4 days later, when neighbors became concerned, police entered the home, to find the bloody bodies of Catherine Eastburn and 2 of her daughters. The youngest Eastburn child, a 22-month-old girl named Jana, was found in the house alive. Police said Gary Eastburn was undergoing training in Alabama at the time of the killings. Hennis came forward to police when he heard on TV news that authorities were looking for a man who visited the house in response to a newspaper ad. Investigators had been gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. A witness named Patrick Cohn said he was near the Eastburn home the night of the killings, and saw a tall white man wearing jeans, a knit cap and a members-only jacket leaving the Eastburns' driveway with a trash bag. A police artist drew a sketch based on Cohn's description. Prosecutors said the sketch resembled Hennis. Police put Hennis in a lineup, and prosecutors said Cohn identified Hennis as the man he saw. In 1986, his first trial, police arrested Hennis, and in 1986, prosecutors put him on trial. They said his motive was sex. The theory was that Hennis' wife was out of town, he had a new baby, and so he decided to make a pass at a married mother of 3, and that didn't go well. Former local reporter Scott Wisnett told CNN's Death Row Stories. Wisnett had covered the case in depth for Wilmington's Morning Star newspaper. Gary Eastburn told police several items were missing from his home, including an envelope of cash, an ATM card, and the Eastburn account password. Police said the ATM card was used to withdraw $150 twice over 2 days. Prosecutors said Hennis was behind on his rent, which was about $300. He paid his rent the Monday after the killings. Prosecutors said a woman who used the same bank ATM shortly after the Eastburns' ATM card was used told investigators she saw a man nearby matching Hennis' description. During the trial, Prosecutors showed jurors gruesome police photos to illustrate their case. The jury rendered a guilty verdict and sentenced Hennis to death. While on death row, Hennis received a mysterious, anonymous letter in the mail. "Dear Mr. Hennis," the letter said, "I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." The letter's author was never determined. A second chance to prove his case. Hennis' lawyers appealed his case to North Carolina's Supreme Court, where judges ruled that the graphic police photos had wrongly influenced jurors to render a guilty verdict. The ruling allowed Hennis a rare second chance to prove his case in a retrial. Compared with the first trial, Hennis' defense attorneys engineered a complete 180 on their strategy. After exhaustive preparation, they attacked many of the prosecutor's most damaging accusations one by one. They discredited the prosecutor's star witness, Patrick Cohn, and his testimony. He had testified that the weather was clear the night of the killings, but another witness said it was overcast. A new defense witness who looked similar to Hennis testified he was walking in the neighborhood at the time of the killings. The witness, John Rawpaw, lived down the street from the Eastburns. Wisnett told Death Row Stories. He was an uneasy sleeper and had a habit of walking the neighborhood at 3 in the morning. He often wore a beanie hat and he had a black members-only jacket. Rawpaw's testimony, defense attorneys said, gave jurors the reasonable doubt they needed to acquit Hennis in 1989. Escaping death row as a newly freed man, Hennis then re-enlisted in the Army, eventually retiring in 2004 as a master sergeant. But prosecutors continued to pursue the case. In 2006, vaginal swabs from a rape kit taken from Catherine Eastburn's body yielded new evidence. DNA testing was an imperfect science in the 1980s, so the semen found in Catherine Eastburn's vagina wasn't pursued as evidence during the first trial. But by the 2000s, technological advances in DNA analysis had improved. Experts said the DNA from Eastburn's rape kit was consistent with Hennis' DNA. U.S. Army steps in. A team of military attorneys evaluated the case and the Army decided to pursue it. Hennis was recalled to active duty 2 years after his retirement and promptly arrested on 3 counts of murder. Tim Hennis is the only person in United States history who's been tried for his life 3 times after guilty and not guilty verdicts, said Wisnett, whose book Innocent Victims was made into a 1996 TV movie. Many observers were surprised. Wasn't Hennis shielded by constitutional protections against so-called double jeopardy? In the simplest terms, if a defendant is acquitted and the prosecutor says to the judge, "I want a do-over," that is clearly prohibited. That's the definition of double jeopardy, said CNN legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. But if a different prosecutor in a different court comes up with a different way to frame charges in the same crime, then that is generally permissible. Major Rob Stell of the Army Judge Advocate General Corps, who worked on the Hennis case, told Death Row Stories that the military's ability to prosecute a case that has already been tried is well settled law. Nothing the state does actually affects what the federal government can do. In a very narrow category of cases where the federal government believes an injustice has been done, then federal prosecutors will step in, Toobin said. But by and large, they operate in separate spheres. When it came down to it, the prosecution's case in Hennis court-martial hinged on the DNA testing results. The sperm found in the vagina of Mrs. Catherine Eastburn is the person who raped and slaughtered her and her children. And that's Timothy Hennis. Major Matt Scott, another Army JAG attorney who worked on the case, told Death Row Stories. The jury rendered a guilty verdict and sentenced Hennis to death. He now sits in solitary confinement on death row at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison in Kansas, awaiting appeal. But many unanswered questions remain. There's a ton of physical evidence in that house that they can't explain, Wisnett told CNN's Death Row Stories. A head hair was found in the Eastburn's bed that is not Hennis, Wisnett said. Unidentified DNA was found under Catherine Eastburn's fingernails. We should be running that DNA against our known database, Wisnett said. Let's find out what happened. It likely will be a long time before the final page is written in this bizarre murder mystery. Even after the appeals process is over, Hennis cannot be executed without presidential approval. In recent years, that hasn't happened very often. The U.S. military has not executed anyone from its ranks since 1961. 9. 34-year-old man finds himself on missing children's website. Residents Steve and Pat Carter's life took a very sharp turn recently when their son, adopted 32 years ago, found himself on a missing children's website. The only background we had about him was what the mother provided to police, that her 6-month-old son's name was Tanzania. He was born on January 16, 1977, and that the ethnicity of his, unnamed, father was native Hawaiian, Carter said. The Carters adopted him and named him William Stephen Tenzin Carter. They called him Steve. For several of years after his adoption, Pat and I had a nagging fear that someone might pop up claiming to be his biological mother or father, Steve said. When nobody did, our anxiety eventually passed. While stationed with the Army in Hawaii, the Carters sought to adopt a child and met the 3-and-1/2-year-old, fair-haired boy. For Pat and me, it was love at first sight, Steve said. The social worker told us that the boy had been in foster care for 3 years, ever since his mother, Janamia, was arrested in Honolulu in June 1977. She had her baby with her at the time of her arrest inside a stranger's house. Taken to a hospital for a mental health evaluation, Jane then disappeared. After 3 years, no other family was found, so the little boy was eligible for adoption. The Carters were always very open with family and friends about Steve's birth history. Every year they celebrate Came to Be Our Boy Day on September 23, the day he came to live with them in 1980. We kept in contact with the woman who had him in foster care. We called her when we had questions about measles or mumps and sent her letters during the holidays, Steve said. When Steve was in high school, they returned to Hawaii and reunited with her during their visit. We belong to an adoptee, birth parent clearinghouse, ALMA, that connects people who are looking for each other, but never received any messages, Carter said. When Steve turned 18, we asked him if he wished to continue registering on the site and he declined. But in 2011, prompted by 2 isolated events, their son became curious about his background. It was somewhat of a family joke that Steve was a native Hawaiian on his father's side, Carter said. With his blonde hair, blue eyes, and light complexion, Steve does not strike one as being of Polynesian extraction. A DNA testing kit, received as a Christmas gift, was meant to put the matter to rest once and for all. The results revealed that Steve's lineage was actually Scandinavian. Then Steve read about Carlina White, who discovered she was kidnapped as an infant from a hospital in New York. The article mentioned references she used for her search, the elder Steve said. Steve searched a website sponsored by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and found something startling. There was a listing for a missing child named Mark Spanamon Moriarty Barnes, that contained an artist's projection of what that child might look like at age 29. It was the spitting image of Steve, his father said. He called Pat and me immediately and told us to look at the website. We were flabbergasted. After many months, it was confirmed that Steve was indeed the missing Mark Spanamon Moriarty Barnes. People magazine wrote about it and the media whirlwind ensued. The Carters accompanied their son and his wife on a trip to New York City, where he was a guest on the daytime talk show, The View. The Carters were introduced on air as they watched the interview from their front row seats in the audience. When asked how they felt about their son's recent connection to his biological roots, Pat said, "I think it's taken a while to get used to the idea that we have to share him. But I'm sure it's going to be wonderful." Whoopi Goldberg then assured them, "You're his parents, so you're fine. The child you raised is your child." The Carters aren't yet sure if they will have contact with the family who reported their son missing so many years ago. Steve has spoken to his biological father several times. "Pat and I have not," Carter said. "We have no plans to meet him, but with Steve's permission, we might somewhere down the road." Recently the Carters joined their son and his wife, Tracy, on a tour of the NCMEC in Alexandria, VA. "We met the artist who created the photo Steve discovered on the web," the elder Steve said. "We also met several investigators from the center and one from the Honolulu Police Department who all worked together on the case following Steve's initial contact. We learned about the wonderful work that the NCMEC does, not only to find missing children, but also to reunite parents and children who have been separated by disasters such as Hurricane Katrina," Carter said. "It's an amazing group of highly skilled and dedicated people. We believe Steve's story is one of hope for all those parents who have suffered, and continue to suffer, the unexpected disappearance of a child," he added.